Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, July 13th, 2023. President Joe Biden in Finland, the newest member of NATO, asked about whether the decision to postpone Ukraine's membership until after its war with Russia ends would embolden Russian President Vladimir Putin to continue the war. Responding, the issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. U.S. House Republican leadership reaching an agreement with its conservative members to have votes on controversial amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, including on abortion and gender-affirming care. Secret Service reportedly ending its investigation of a small baggie of cocaine found at the White House and finding not enough evidence to determine who left it there. We'll hear from members of Congress who were given a classified briefing by the Secret Service today. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry answers tough questions about the Biden administration's climate policy ahead of a trip to China today before a House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. And in another hearing, the Federal Trade Commission Chair, Lina, challenged on her decision not to recuse herself in a case involving large technology company Meta, contrary to an ethics office recommendation. And Vice President Kamala Harris tying the record for the most tie-breaking votes cast in the Senate by a U.S. Vice President. And now to Helsinki, Finland, President Biden's last stop on his European trip, where he met with the leaders of the Nordic countries. 3 have been longtime NATO members, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. Finland is the newest member, and Sweden will be joining soon. President Biden just finished up a NATO summit in Lithuania, where he, NATO members, and G7 countries promised long-term support for Ukraine in its war with Russia and laid out a vision for eventual Ukrainian membership in NATO. Today, President Biden was asked by a reporter about those decisions.
Wall Street Journal. Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. President. You've said that Ukraine shouldn't enter NATO until after the war is over. Are you concerned at all that those comments could motivate Putin to keep the war going or discourage him from entering peace negotiations? And is there a serious risk that this war could drag on for years? And do you see any path toward the war ending with Putin still in power?
First of all, no one can join NATO while a war is going on, where a NATO nation is being attacked, because that guarantees that we're in a war, and we're in a third world war. So that it's not about whether or not they should or shouldn't join. It's about when they can join, and they will join NATO. The issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he could end the war tomorrow. He could just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine anyway, he's already lost that war.
Just on the question of a concern about it going on for years, is there a possibility that there's a stalemate in this becoming?
I'm sorry?
The question of whether the war could go on for years, is there a possibility there's a stalemate and it can continue for quite some time?
Well, I don't think the war can go on for years for 2 reasons. Number one, I don't think that that Russia could maintain the war forever, number one, in terms of their resources and capacity. Number two, I think that there is going to be a circumstance where eventually President Putin is going to decide it's not in the interest of Russia, economically, politically, or otherwise, to continue this war. But I can't predict exactly how that happens. My hope is, and my expectation is, you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive, and that it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line.
And I have a question for the Finnish president, but I would be remiss if I didn't raise my colleague Evan Gershkovich, who's been in prison for more than 100 days. I just wondered if you had an update on the process for trying to get him out of prison, and if you're serious about a prisoner exchange.
Oh, I'm serious about prisoner exchange. I'm serious about doing all we can to free Americans from being illegally held in Russia or anywhere else for that matter. And that process is underway.
President Biden at a joint news conference with the Finnish president in Helsinki today. A CNN article says that this is the same site where former President Donald Trump met one-on-one for 2 hours with Russia's President Vladimir Putin exactly 5 years ago this week. That summit saw the then U.S. president siding with his Russian counterpart over whether the Kremlin interfered in the 2016 election in a stunning rebuke of U.S. intelligence that caused concern both in Washington and in allied capitals around the world. That reporting from CNN. An article from Reuters, President Putin said on Thursday Russia was set to withdraw from a deal allowing the export of Ukrainian grain via the Black Sea, unless its own demands are met, reaffirming Moscow's tough stance ahead of the deal's expiring next Monday. President Biden today also getting a question about a U.S. domestic issue. Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican from Alabama, is holding up hundreds of military nominations and promotions over a Defense Department policy that allows leave and reimbursement for the costs for personnel stationed in states that restrict abortion to travel to other states to get those services.
You're seeing the GOP grappling with tying abortion rights to defense issues, including a block on military promotions by Senator Tuberville. What does this say about U.S. military readiness? And would you be willing to talk with Tuberville to try to work out some solution?
I'd be willing to talk to him if I thought there was any possibility of him changing this ridiculous position he has. He's jeopardizing U.S. security by what he's doing. I expect the Republican Party to stand up and do something about it. It's in their power to do that. The idea that we don't have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the idea that we have all these promotions that are in abeyance right now, that we don't know what's going to happen, the idea that we're injecting into fundamental foreign policy decisions what in fact as a domestic social debate on social issues is bizarre. I don't ever recall that happening, ever. And it's just totally irresponsible in my view. And I just think that, I'm confident that the mainstream of the Republican Party no longer does not support what he's doing. But they got to stand up and be counted. That's how it ends.
President Biden at a news conference in Helsinki, Finland. He is now returning to the United States after his European trip. The Pentagon says that the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin did speak by phone with Senator Tommy Tuberville about this issue and will speak again about it next week. And in Washington, in the U.S. House, an amendment to reverse the Pentagon policy on abortion offered to the National Defense Authorization Act. The Hill.com writes that House Republicans reached an agreement to allow votes on controversial amendments to the NDAA, resolving a battle within the party while potentially making passage of the must-pass bill more difficult. The amendments include proposals on Ukraine funding, the Pentagon's abortion policy, and more social issues pushed by the party's right flank. That from The Hill. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was asked by a reporter about this amendment on abortion to be offered by Congressman Ronnie Jackson, the Republican of Texas.
On the NDAA,
yes.
Some of your more moderate members, even just coming out of this meeting, say they're being put in a tough spot on some of these votes, especially like controversial Jackson amendment on abortion, and that you've caved to your right flank.
You know, it's interesting when you look at, that's your question, but it doesn't mean that's the truth. When you're in Congress, why do you have amendments on the floor? You're able to take whatever position you want. What's interesting to me when you put forth, I don't know why you're asking the Democrats, why do the Democrats think we should spend taxpayer money to pay for abortion or to pay for wokeism in our military? Do they want Disneyland to train our military? Or do they want a military force to be able to protect us and actually never go to war? So I don't think that's a problem to let members of Congress who are elected by their constituents to have a voice and a say. It can go either way. What's interesting to me is you think it's a problem that now I have opened up Congress. Now, people can be here, people can see our vote, but actually members of Congress now have to show up to do their job. They actually have to be part of the committee, and then they actually have a voice with what the bill will look like at the very end. It doesn't predetermine what will be in the bill, but what it does say is every American who lends their voice to their member of Congress will have a say. And I think that's fair.
Do you support that? Do you support that Ronnie Jackson amendment?
Yes, I do.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, with reporters earlier today on Capitol Hill, talking about the House Rules Committee approving 80 amendments to be offered to the National Defense Authorization Act on the House floor. And later in the day, Congressman Ronnie Jackson, Republican from Texas, did offer his amendment. You'll hear opposition from Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, Democrat from New Jersey.
According to its illegal policy, which is now in place, DOD can and will reimburse travel expenses for service members and their dependents who travel specifically to obtain an abortion in another state. DOD will also reimburse any associated fees for healthcare professionals seeking to be licensed in another state for the purpose of performing abortion, all on the taxpayer's dime. Last year, immediately after DOD started this unconstitutional illegal process, Congressman Roy and I got to work immediately on addressing this issue and developed a bill to right this wrong. This illegal Biden-endorsed policy has no place in our military. Taxpayer money provided to DOD is intended to provide for our national defense and our national security, not to promote and support the Biden administration's radical and immoral pro-abortion agenda. As I mentioned, regardless of your political or personal stance on abortion, this policy is in direct violation of federal law, specifically Section 1093 of U.S. Code Title 10, which restricts funds made available to the DOD from being used for abortions. No doubt my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will insist that taxpayer dollars are not directly funding abortions, thereby rendering the current policy legally sound. This is absolutely misleading. The taxpayer money is going directly to support abortions, and anyone in this chamber that says differently is blatantly lying to the American people. Taxpayer funding of travel for an abortion is, in fact, taxpayer-funded abortion. Abortion is the sole reason for these travel expenses, and this is in clear violation of existing law. My Democratic colleagues want me to blame me, Senator Tuberville, and my colleagues like Congressman Roy for jeopardizing readiness. However, it is the Biden administration who has sidestepped existing law and given the department permission to take this illegal action. This has left us with no choice but to take corrective measures and pass additional legislation. The days of the radical left ignoring the law and pushing their destructive social agenda in the military are done. I absolutely will not waver in my defense of the rule of law, therefore ensuring that taxpayer money is not used to kill innocent babies, and in doing so also ensure that our military service members can focus on the jobs that they have in front of them and their families instead of being used for the political gain of the Biden administration. This amendment has over 70 co-sponsors because we all recognize that the Department of Defense is carrying out an illegal policy that is divisive, immoral, and does nothing to provide for our national defense or promote our national security. I want to thank my friend Congressman Chip Roy for co-leading this amendment with me and for being a relentless defender of the law and a true warrior in protecting the life of the unborn. I also want to thank the Military Personnel Subcommittee Chairman Jim Banks for his support of my amendment and his work on readying our service members for the real threats that they face. Last, I want to thank Chairman Rogers for creating the strongest defense bill I have seen during my time in Congress. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment to repeal this outrageous and illegal policy and prevent any similar policy in the future. With that, Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentlewoman from New Jersey is. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to address the amendment in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise today in vehement opposition to the amendment proposed by Rep. Jackson. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to thank the troops and talk about honoring their sacrifice, and that's all, frankly, empty words and broken promises if this amendment passes. This amendment puts servicewomen and military families' lives at risk by denying the basic right to travel for health care, no longer available where they are stationed. Now that Iowa passed anti-abortion restrictions, 46% of servicewomen do not have access to abortion care. This would enact a dangerous health care travel ban. Service members signed up to put their lives on the line for our freedoms, our national values, our constitutional rights. They did not sign up to put their lives on the line or their spouses' lives on the line because they cannot get access to basic care. I was an officer in the Navy. What I learned was that good leaders protect their squadron. They don't abandon them in favor of their own politics or agenda. How am I supposed to recommend to young girls in my district that they should attend a service academy like I did when we know this amendment would mean that they'd be signing away their right to basic health care? This amendment makes our servicewomen pawns in their extreme agenda and is a stepping stone to larger bans, restrictions, and wholesale disregard with women's health care in America.
Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, Democrat from New Jersey, and before that, the amendment's sponsor, Congressman Ronnie Jackson, Republican from Texas, part of the debate on the National Defense Authorization Act, providing policy and program authorization for the next fiscal year. Another amendment to the bill coming from Congressman Matt Rosendale, Republican from Montana, dealing with care for those who identify as transgender. You'll hear opposition from Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, Democrat from California.
It would prohibit TRICARE from covering sex reassignment surgeries and hormone treatment for transgender individuals. The most recent numbers tell us that the Department of Defense has performed over 240 gender reassignment surgeries, costing taxpayers approximately $3.1 million. Unfortunately, that's just a small part of the costs associated with this transaction. The department has also spent over $11.5 million on psychotherapy. That's it, psychotherapy for service members with gender dysphoria. The amount of funds paid out for this psychotherapy shows that the surgery alone cannot solve the root issue for these individuals. This does nothing to help our troops continue to be the most effective fighting force on earth, and is nothing but a distraction and a waste of valuable taxpayers' dollars. The government has no business funding these procedures on the taxpayers' dime. The question that must be asked is whether we're having trans individuals makes the United States a more lethal force, and whether it helps recruit the best and most effective talent for the United States military. And the answer to that is a clear and resounding no. A report commissioned by General Mattis found that service members with claims of gender dysphoria are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than other service members. It also found that these individuals are 9 times more likely to have negative mental health episodes than other service members. As Thomas Spohr, a former Army Lieutenant General, put it, if those with gender dysphoria are at a much higher risk of suicide, crippling anxiety, or mental breakdowns than their peers, those serving next to them will be reluctant to rely on them. Permitting them to serve also violates the principle of not placing individuals at greater risk of injury in harm's way. Madam Speaker, to summarize this, anything that does not contribute to making our fighting force the most effective fighting force on earth is nothing more than a distraction, and I will not ask the people of Montana or the United States to pay for it. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I claim the time in opposition to the amendment and ask to yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman has 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. Trans service members have served and served successfully for years. In fact, trans people are even more likely to serve in the U.S. military than cisgender people. So it's mind-boggling that we would want to deter and discriminate against a group of people who have proven their patriotism and deep commitment to our country. All of us are well aware that we're facing steep military recruitment and retention challenges. This amendment will worsen this crisis by pushing transgender service members out of the military. And that's because gender-affirming care is necessary and medically backed. Care that gives you the ability to be your true, authentic self is primary care, and it's not something that should be easily dismissed. If our service members constantly worry about their right to exist, their ability to serve our country is jeopardized, and it harms our readiness and ability to respond quickly and effectively to national security challenges. I'm not alone in this. Secretary Austin agrees that allowing people to serve as their authentic selves is the right and the smart thing to do for our military operations. That's why I urge my colleagues to do the right thing for our values and our readiness and oppose this harmful amendment.
Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, Democrat from California, and before that you heard this sponsor of the amendment, Congressman Matt Rosendale, Republican from Montana. In all, 80 amendments made in order to the National Defense Authorization Act in this second rule from the Rules Committee governing debate on the House floor. And some of the others include removing $300 million in aid to Ukraine from the bill, prohibiting military assistance to that country, reinstating military members punished for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine, and eliminating military diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or training. The House is expected to finish up all the amendments and have a vote on final passage on this bill on Friday. The underlying bill authorizes $886 billion for defense programs in the next fiscal year. While that's happening in the House, the Senate committee has passed its own version of the NDAA, and the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, today on the Senate floor, talked about the debate that's expected there next week.
Yesterday, I moved to proceed to the National Defense Authorization Act. We'll have our first vote on Tuesday. This bill was reported out of the Armed Services Committee on a huge 25-1 bipartisan vote. We're encouraging filing amendments for the manager's package before the close of business today. Senator McConnell, the committees, and I will have our teams working over the weekend to see what we can include in the package of amendments. Undoubtedly, hundreds of amendments will be filed to this important piece of legislation. I'm hopeful that all committee chairs and committee rankers will work together in good faith. Obviously, both sides will want to have amendment votes. Just like we have in recent efforts, I am willing to ensure we consider and vote a reasonable number of amendments. No senator wants a dilatory process. I know Senators Reid and Wicker, who have done such a fine job putting together a bipartisan bill, will work with Senator McConnell and me, and we will develop a list of amendment votes and hopefully can proceed from there. There are important issues that I believe we must address while we're on the floor. We must consider a Chinese government competition package. We must consider the Australia, United Kingdom, and United States submarine deal. I know there will be more to do here next week, and I look forward to the debate on the floor.
Senator Chuck Schumer, the Majority Leader, Democrat from New York, today on the Senate floor. And the House working on its version of the Defense Policy and Programs bill. The Senate will do that next week. When they both pass their versions, they'll have to reconcile into one version that can then pass both chambers and be signed by President Biden by the end of the fiscal year. Sometimes it does spill over, and it's a little bit later than the start of the new fiscal year, October 1st. There have been 62 straight NDAAs signed into law in the past 62 years. This is Washington Today. From NBC News, the mystery of who brought cocaine into the White House remains unsolved. The Secret Service investigation has concluded with no usable forensic or video evidence identifying the person responsible. 3 Secret Service officials familiar with the investigation tell NBC News. At the request of the U.S. House Oversight and Accountability Committee chair, the Secret Service gave a closed-door briefing today to committee members about this investigation. And after a few of those members came out to speak with reporters, here is Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia.
American citizens every single day go through drug tests as part of their employment for their jobs. This is a common practice. Just speaking with the Secret Service now, my question to them was, they were able to narrow down a list of approximately 500 people that had left a small bag of cocaine in a cubby. Now, these are cubbies that are controlled by the administration, not by the Secret Service, when they enter into the foyer off the West Executive entrance. This cocaine was found there, so they were able to bring the list, narrow it down to approximately 500 people. My question to them was, have they drug tested this list of 500 potential suspects that brought an illegal substance, a drug, cocaine, into the White House? Their answer was no, and that they're unwilling to do so. It makes no sense to me whatsoever why they would not follow through on one simple task, and that is to drug test a list of 500 people that they have that are potential suspects for this, when the American people every single day go through drug tests in order to do a job, by the way, that brings them a paycheck where they have to pay their taxes. And guess what? Their tax dollars go to pay for all of our salaries, and they pay for the Secret Service. This is a failure of this investigation to not perform a drug test on these people. This list of approximately 500 potential suspects. There are other concerns there as well. How there's a cubby box that has a key. How they found that it left open and the drugs were in there. There's also a failure with the amount of cameras they have, and I just don't find the excuses on how we can't find out who had cocaine in the White House.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, with reporters outside the classified briefing from the Secret Service on the investigation of that cocaine found at the White House. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, Republican from Colorado, also coming out and telling reporters the Secret Service told the lawmakers that 0.007 grams, 7 milligrams of cocaine was found. Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from New York, ranking member on the Oversight Committee, also spoke with reporters.
It seems like there's a constructive dialogue that's going on between the Secret Service and the White House about what might be done to further improve security there. So they would be able to at least find someone who ditched a baggie of drugs on their way out or on their way in.
A lot of members have come out, mostly Republican members, really frustrated with the Secret Service briefing. And so they voice their frustrations in there. Do you understand their frustration? Do you think that it's overblown? What's kind of your reaction?
I've heard Republican members suggest that they should drug test everybody who was in the White House for that week or that day, which is hundreds or thousands of people. And that would strike me as a massively disproportionate and overblown response that would violate people's civil liberties. I mean, if there were a small amount of marijuana or cocaine found somewhere in the Capitol complex, we would not want to drug test everybody who works here. So I'm satisfied that the Secret Service and the White House are on top of it. I was reading a book about Lincoln recently, and anybody in Washington could just walk right into Lincoln's White House, go directly in and try to find the president and talk to him. And obviously we're in a very different security environment than that. But I don't know how many people would want to go to the White House if they were going to be administering a drug test on the way in, which is what some of my colleagues have suggested. Some people are saying everybody should be drug tested on the way into the White House. And, these are the same people who are opposed to COVID-19 tests. So I don't see a lot of coherence in the criticism.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, the ranking member on the Oversight and Accountability Committee, outside the closed-door briefing from the Secret Service on the cocaine found at the White House. More from the NBC News article. In a review of recent years, the Secret Service found 2 incidents where a small amount of marijuana was detected by uniformed division officers, and a report was filed. Secret Service officials said no charges were brought because the amounts were legal under Washington, D.C. law at the time, and the individuals were notified they could not bring the marijuana to the White House campus. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word, brings you a recap of the day's most important events. Find out what happened on Capitol Hill, the White House, and with policymakers, all delivered straight to your inbox. Subscribe now at cspan.org/connect.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A few more headlines. The FDA has approved the first over-the-counter birth control pill available in the United States. It's called Opal. Director of the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research saying in a statement that today's approval marks the first time a non-prescription daily oral contraceptive will be available for millions of people in the United States. When used as directed, daily oral contraception is safe and is expected to be more effective than currently available non-prescription contraceptive methods in preventing unintended pregnancy. This development comes 6 decades after the first FDA approval of prescription birth control pills. And Black Lives Matter movement marking its 10th anniversary today, asking local and national elected officials to designate July 13th as Black Lives Matter Day, and also launching a Defund the Police Week of Action. The special climate envoy, John Kerry, writes Politico, said Thursday he will not be conceding anything on his upcoming visit to China as he seeks to reestablish dialogue to combat climate change. The trip to Beijing, starting Sunday, marks a formal restart to climate talks between the two countries, which China halted after then-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last year. But John Kerry set modest expectations, noting climate is just one of many issues that the Biden administration has tried to navigate as they cautiously re-engage the United States' top geopolitical rival and the world's biggest contributor to rising temperatures. That reporting from Politico. John Kerry was questioned today at the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Here is Congressman Nathaniel Moran, Republican from Texas.
In the past decade, as you know, we've reduced emissions here in the United States, but in the same time frame, China's emissions have increased. All the while, they continue to say, we're working on it. And all the while, you continue to go over there and ask them to work on it, but we have not seen real deliberate action on their part to match the U.S.'s efforts in this regard. Is that correct?
We have actually seen some action which isn't evident to everybody because people, they don't advertise it. But I'll tell you what's happening. Let me just answer your question. China is deploying, manufacturing and deploying more renewable energy than all the rest of the world put together. That's what they're doing. China right now has about somewhere in the vicinity of a couple of thousand gigawatts, but they're now going up. And by 2030, our judgment is China may well be around 2,200, 2,400 gigawatts of renewable.
The pollution that's coming out of China
Correct.
exceeds.
That's exactly why we're working at what we're doing.
And you said yourself, quote, earlier, this is a global, universal issue, and we don't want it to become captive to other issues. But I'm curious when you say that, if you're ignoring these other issues like my colleague brought up here, human rights issues, would you agree that human rights issues are also global, universal issues?
Absolutely.
But you want to keep them separate when you're talking to China, is what you said earlier. Is that true?
What I said is, no, we don't keep them separate in terms of our priorities.
No, that's exactly
I go
what you
there.
said. You said President Xi and President Biden agreed at the outset to separate out the climate issue
Correct.
so it wouldn't get caught up in these other issues.
Correct.
So were you correct?
That
then,
doesn't mean you don't talk about them.
Well,
but it means that they're not going to become showstoppers so that they're playing one off against the other. I'll give you an example. We don't trade any component of any of those other issues for what we're trying to do on the climate front. On the climate front, we've agreed we will deal with that, and we have to find a pathway forward. And there are others, the Assistant Secretary of State, the Secretary of State, the NSC, who deal directly on those other issues.
Okay, and I presume that you're
you know what we're trying to do? We're trying to make sure that you don't have to worry that John Kerry is going to give away some right on human rights in order to get what he's trying to get.
So I get that, and I presume
I
presume that you're going to have conferences with your counterparts that are having those discussions on those other issues, and that President Biden has said to you and those others which one is more priority over the other. So my question would be: is human rights the bigger issue? Is the slave labor coming out of the Uyghur people
this
a bigger
administration
issue, or
is
is it
capable of
climate
keeping
change?
all its priorities on the table and of treating all of them simultaneously. But we don't have to wrap them up so one becomes hostage to the other, or you don't make progress.
You plan to hold China accountable if they do not follow through with the activities that you're going to suggest and to reduce their emissions, because they're able to get ahead of our economy by producing many more emissions and having less regulatory action on their businesses than we are here in the United States.
And we don't want that to happen. That is precisely
then how are you going to hold them accountable?
Because that's exactly why President Biden has asked us to examine the countervailing
I have never
measures.
seen an examination hold anybody accountable. We need action to hold
Well,
them
that's
accountable.
exactly what's happening, and you've got several senators. You have some in the House.
John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at a House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee hearing, questioned by Congressman Nathaniel Moran, Republican from Texas. Associated Press writing about this hearing and many of the exchanges that John Kerry had. This paragraph in the article, fireworks broke out again after Congressman Corey Mills, a Florida Republican, made a reference to claims that John Kerry conducts his climate work by private jet, saying he hoped it wasn't too problematic for your operational team and your private jet to get here. John Kerry singled that out as, quote, one of the most outrageously persistent lies that I hear, which is this private jet. He said, I don't own a private jet. I personally have never owned a private jet, adding that it was pretty stupid to talk about coming to Capitol Hill by private jet from his office at the State Department. That reporting from Associated Press. You can find the full hearing at our website, cspan.org. First Lady Jill Biden speaking today about the economy and workforce training and education at the National Governors Association Annual Conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The NGA currently chaired by New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, a Democrat.
In May, we announced what we're calling the Workforce Hubs Initiative. I don't know how they came up with that name. But anyway, it focuses on 5 key cities. All right, that's my staff laughing back there. I don't care. I just don't like that name. It's like they should have had something catchier, you know? Anyway, we're in Phoenix, Columbus, Baltimore, Augusta, and Pittsburgh. And they've received significant investments from legislation like the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as private companies. And in these cities, the Biden-Harris administration is partnering with, all of you, local officials, employers, unions, community colleges, high schools, and other partners to ensure that we have a skilled workforce that can meet the demand for labor-created investments. So these efforts are not going to only strengthen these 5 cities. They're going to provide models that we can replicate across the country. So yesterday, I visited the Workforce Hub in Columbus, Ohio, and the energy and the enthusiasm there really were unmistakable. And they're creating new pathways to local jobs that will change people's lives. And Joe's father used to say, and I agree with this, a job is a lot more, about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. And I see this with my own students.
The First Lady Jill Biden at the National Governors Association meeting in Atlantic City, New Jersey today. NGA was founded in 1908 and calls itself the voice of the leaders of the 55 states, territories, and commonwealths. The NGA chair is Governor Phil Murphy, Democrat from New Jersey. He and the incoming chair, Governor Spencer Cox, Republican from Utah, will be guests on Friday morning's Washington Journal on C-SPAN. The Journal starts at 7 a.m. Eastern, and the 2 governors will be on at 8 a.m. Eastern. You can listen and watch on C-SPAN Radio, C-SPAN Television, cspan.org, on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app, and on your smart device. Say, play C-SPAN Radio. Wall Street today, the Dow up 47, NASDAQ up 219, S&P up 37. The chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Lina testified today before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. AP with a preview article writing, Committee Chair Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, has criticized Lina in recent months on a multitude of issues, including what he says are politically motivated actions directed at Elon Musk after he acquired Twitter last year, and questions about whether she should have recused herself from certain cases and her legal actions against tech giants on antitrust issues. On recusal, this came up in questions to the chair from Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, Republican from Wyoming. You're going to hear a reference to DAEO, that's D-A-E-O, which is a designated agency ethics official.
On June 16, 2023, a Bloomberg journalist published a leaked memoranda written by the FTC's DAEO analyzing Chair Khan's ability to sit as a judge in the FTC's review of Meta's acquisition of a company called Within. According to the ethics memoranda, the DAO, quote, recommended you recuse to avoid an appearance of partiality concern pursuant to federal ethics regulations. Do you believe that you were completely honest and forthcoming with Congress when you asked if there were, quote, any instances where you had not followed the DAO's advice, and you answered no? Yes or no?
Yes, Congresswoman.
Okay. In the letter that you sent to this committee yesterday evening, you claim that you received only oral advice from the DAO, but never saw the leaked memo until after you decided not to recuse yourself. First, it is unbelievable to me that you would not ask for written ethics advice on this particular topic. You admit that you have written ethics advice on other topics, but on this topic you claim you did not see the written memo. Instead, you want us to believe that you only received oral advice and not specific oral advice, but only general advice on, quote, understanding the legal framework, end quote. Did DAO give you advice that is different than what was written in the memoranda?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. So my work before I joined the commission was focused on assessing the power of large technology.
I need you to answer the question that I asked. The question that I asked was, did you receive different oral advice than what was written in the memoranda from DAO? Very simple question.
So I consulted with the ethics official. The ethics official, as was noted in the memo that you cited, although I did not receive that memo, noted that the ultimate framework for instances in which somebody has no financial conflicts of interest.
Did she give you different oral advice than what was in the written memoranda?
The legal framework
yes or no?
is for the employee to themselves determine whether they should or should not recuse.
Did she give you different advice than what was orally than was in the written memoranda? Yes or no?
Congressman, as was noted in the written memoranda, there was no ethics violation created by my participating in the matter.
But you didn't follow the DAO's advice, did you? You could have recused at any time, couldn't you?
I followed the determination that there was no ethics
you could have recused at any time, couldn't you?
There was no violation under the ethics laws because I have not a penny in financial stock, not a penny in financial interest.
The DAO gave you the advice to recuse and you did not do so, correct?
Congresswoman, as was noted in the memo, as I noted in the letter.
I'm going to move on since you're not willing to answer my question.
Questions to the Federal Trade Commission Chair, Lina from Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, Republican from Wyoming. Again, DAO, D-A-E-O, is Designated Agency Ethics Official. On Tuesday, the FTC lost another big tech case. A federal judge declined the FTC's request to block Microsoft's $69 billion takeover of video game company Activision Blizzard. In the Senate, Vice President Kamala Harris tying the record of casting tie-breaking votes by a vice president. 31 total. It matches John C. Calhoun, who was vice president from 1825 to 1832. Here is Vice President Harris presiding in the Senate Wednesday night during a procedural vote related to the nomination of an EEOC commissioner. You'll hear her make the call, and then congratulations from the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being evenly divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to.
Madam President and Madam Vice President,
Majority Leader,
I want to note that this is a history-making moment for the United States Senate. Today, Vice President Kamala Harris matches the record for the most tie-breaking votes ever cast in the United States by a vice president. The Constitution says that, quote, the Vice President of the United States shall be the President of the Senate, and with that comes the immense burden of casting votes whenever this chamber is evenly split. When it's mattered most, Vice President Harris has provided the decisive vote on some of the most historic bills of modern times, from the American Rescue Plan to the Inflation Reduction Act, to so many federal judges who now preside and provide balance on the federal bench. She's carried out her duties with supreme excellence, and today, all of us, thank her for making the work of the Senate possible. We also thank Vice President Harris for doing all this work despite all the other demands she faces as the nation's Vice President, from leading the charge on protecting freedom of choice, to speaking out on criminal justice reform and gun safety, to pushing for climate justice. Our nation is stronger, fairer, more prosperous because of the work of the Vice President. So, Madam Vice President, on this historic day, thank you. Thank you for your leadership and your service to this institution and to the United States of America.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor Wednesday night after Vice President Kamala Harris cast that record-tying, tie-breaking vote in the Senate 31, and that ties John C. Calhoun, who was vice president in the early 1800s. There was some speculation that Vice President Harris would break the record today with the final confirmation vote on that EEOC commissioner, but she was not needed. Some senators were absent, and the vote was 49 to 47. A team of female D.C.-based journalists beat the team of bipartisan female members of Congress in last night's 15th annual Congressional Women's Softball Game. One of the play-by-play and color commentators, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. And here she is making the call of the final out of the game. It was a play at home plate. And then a wrap-up with the final score and the amount of charity money raised.
Another strong power hit. Two coming in. We're going to have a play at the plate. Wow. End of the game. It was a power end. It was a power end. 15 to 9. And guess the most important thing. How much money raised? As you all know, tonight's proceeds benefit the Young Survival Coalition, the premier organization dedicated to the critical issues unique to young adults with breast cancer. And again, tonight's game raised $588,000, and congratulations to the winner, the Bad News Babes.
Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat from Minnesota, doing announcer's duty at last night's Congressional Women's Softball Game on Capitol Hill in Washington. An article in Roll Call about the game has this: climate activists took over the field at the game on Wednesday night, stopping play for more than 10 minutes and setting off a rival dance party. Around a dozen protesters entered the outfield during the first inning of the charity event, wearing T-shirts with the message "End Fossil Fuels." They linked arms and stood in a circle. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.